Julian Croft, a man who could command markets and bend industries to his will with a single phone call, was powerless. He stood in the doorway of his son's bedroom, a silent, gilded cage, and felt the familiar crushing weight of his failure. He was one of the richest men on the planet, his name a synonym for success, but no amount of money could fix the still, silent form of his 8-year-old son, Leo. The boy hadn't truly woken up in 6 months. Not since the accident that had claimed his mother, Elia. The doctors called it a state of pervasive refusal syndrome, a profound psychological withdrawal manifesting as a coma-like shutdown. They said his mind had simply stopped after firing 7 of the country's most decorated and expensive in-home nurses. Julian was at the end of his rope, a king trapped in a castle of his own making, haunted by the ghost of his son's laughter. His last hope was pinned on the most unlikely of candidates, a woman whose resume was a testament to quiet efficiency in cleaning houses, not healing minds. Her name was Elara Vance, and she had a pain in her eyes that Julian recognized, for he saw it in his own reflection every morning. He didn't know then that she carried a past that would allow her to see what a world of experts had missed, or that her arrival would trigger a shocking event that would break him completely, only to rebuild him into the father his son truly needed. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Croft Mansion was less a home and more a museum of modern architecture, a monolith of glass, steel, and stark white marble perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. It was a place of echoes and emptiness, where the rhythmic hiss of the state-of-the-art air filtration system was the only constant sound. Every surface gleamed, scrubbed clean by a staff that moved with the hushed reverence of undertakers. Julian had built this fortress to keep the world out, but in doing so, he had sealed the silence in. Elara Vance arrived on a Tuesday morning, the fog rolling off the ocean to cling to the imposing iron gates. She was unassuming in a simple gray dress, her hands clasped around the strap of a worn leather bag. The head of security, a grim-faced man named Marcus, had already vetted her, of course. Her file was thin, 34 years old, widowed, a string of housekeeping jobs for wealthy but less formidable families. There was a sealed juvenile record and a gap of 2 years she had explained away as caring for a sick relative. Julian hadn't cared. He was desperate. The agency had assured him she was discreet and diligent, and at this point, that was more than he could say for the condescending specialists who had paraded through his home. Her duties, as outlined by the stone-faced house manager, Mrs. Gable, were simple. Maintain the second floor, which included the master suite, several guest rooms, and Leo's wing. She was not to engage with Leo. She was not a nurse. The boy had round-the-clock medical care, a team that monitored his vitals from a small, sterile room adjacent to his own. She was simply to clean, to be invisible, a ghost to service the ghosts already haunting the house. Elara nodded, her gaze soft but unwavering. She understood the rules of these houses. You saw everything and said nothing. You became part of the furniture. But the moment she stepped into Leo's room, the rules began to fray. The room was a monument to arrested development. Expensive toys sat in pristine condition on shelves, a state-of-the-art gaming system gathered dust, and books with vibrant covers were lined up with military precision. It was a child's room as designed by an adult who had forgotten what it was to be a child. The air was cool and smelled of antiseptic. In the center of it all was a large, automated bed, and within it, the small, still form of Leo Croft. His skin was pale, his dark curls fanned out on the white pillow. A feeding tube was taped neatly to his cheek, and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor provided the room's only percussion. A nurse, a stern-looking woman named Agnes, sat in a chair by the window, knitting without looking up. Elara began her work, her movements economical and silent. She dusted the shelves, polished the windows that looked out onto the endless gray ocean, and mopped the marble floors until they reflected the overcast sky like a mirror. All the while she watched, she observed. She saw how the boy's eyelids, though closed, seemed to flutter almost imperceptibly when the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds and sliced across his face. She noticed how the steady rhythm of the heart monitor seemed to quicken just for a beat or two when the nurse would administer the afternoon dose of medication through his IV line. These were things a machine would register as minor fluctuations, statistical noise. But to Ilara, who had spent years learning the silent language of suffering, they were whispers. Her inciting moment, the first crack in the official story, came on her third day. It was just after 3 p.m., the time Mrs. Gable had informed her was for medication and vitals. Nurse Agnes was preparing a syringe, her back to the bed. A low, continuous hum emanated from a large air purifier in the corner of the room. It was a white noise machine, essentially, meant to provide a soothing, constant sound. But as Ilara was wiping down the baseboard near the unit, her cloth snagged the power cord, pulling it from the wall. The hum abruptly ceased. The silence that rushed in was absolute, profound. The only sound was the gentle beeping of the monitor, and in that silence it happened. Leo's left hand, which lay palm up on the crisp white sheets, twitched. It was not a spasm. It was a clear, deliberate clenching of his small fingers into a fist, a motion that lasted for a full 2 seconds before relaxing. Nurse Agnes didn't see it. Her focus was on the medicine, but Ilara saw. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the small, pale hand, now resting peacefully again. It was a signal, a flicker of life in the deep, dark well of his silence, a protest against the sudden absence of a sound he had grown accustomed to. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She slowly, carefully plugged the machine back in. The low hum returned, filling the room once more. She watched Leo's hand. Nothing. It remained perfectly still. It wasn't the presence of a sound that mattered, but the absence of it. It was a change in the environment, a break in the monotonous sensory input he was subjected to day in and day out. The doctors, the nurses, the specialists, they were all looking for a response. They were trying to force a signal out. They had never thought to listen to the silence, to see what happened when the noise they created was taken away. In that moment, dusting a baseboard in a billionaire's mansion, Ilara Vance knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the official diagnosis was wrong. Leo wasn't gone, he was trapped. And she, a simple housekeeper, was the only one who had just heard him knock on the door from the inside. For the next 2 weeks, Ilara turned Leo's room into her silent laboratory. She adhered strictly to her duties, a model of quiet compliance in the eyes of Mrs. Gable and the rotating nursing staff. But her work was a cover for a deeper, more meticulous investigation. Her cleaning became a series of controlled experiments, each one designed to test the fragile hypothesis she had formed on that third day, that Leo was not absent but imprisoned in a sensory prison, and that change, not consistency, was the key. She began with sound. The white noise machine was a constant, a monotonous hum designed to soothe, but she suspected it was more of a blanket, smothering any other potential stimuli. During her allotted cleaning hour, when the day nurse, Agnes, would take her break, Ilara would introduce subtle variations. One day she left the door to the hallway slightly ajar, allowing the distant muted sounds of the house, the chime of a grandfather clock, the soft footsteps of staff, to filter in. She watched Leo from the corner of her eye as she polished a silver picture frame containing a photo of a smiling woman with Leo's eyes, his mother. She saw it again, a flicker of his eyelids, a brief tightening of the muscles around his mouth. The heart monitor registered a momentary spike from a resting 68 beats per minute to 72 before settling back down. It was small, almost nothing, but it was not nothing. Another day she brought a small battery-operated music box from a thrift store, a cheap thing she kept in her apron pocket. It played a simple, tinkling rendition of Clair de Lune. She placed it on the far side of the room, behind a large armchair, and let it play for only 30 seconds. Leo's breathing pattern changed. The slow, shallow rhythm deepened for 3 breaths, a subconscious intake of a new stimulus. When she stopped the music, his breathing returned to its baseline. She documented everything in a small, cheap notebook she kept hidden in her locker in the staff quarters, noting the date, time, stimulus, and observed reaction. To anyone else, the scribbles would look like nonsense. To Ilara, it was a conversation. Next, she moved to scent. The room was a sterile bubble, smelling only of laundry detergent and antiseptic wipes. It was a scent of sickness. Ilara remembered from her own past how smells were tied to memory, to emotion. One morning she tucked a small sprig of lavender, picked from a forgotten corner of the mansion's vast gardens, into her pocket. As she dusted the bedside table, she let it rest there for a minute. The faint floral scent mingled with the sterile air. Leo's nostrils flared just once, a tiny involuntary movement. A week later, she brought in a single, peeled orange, its sharp citrus scent a stark contrast to the room's chemical cleanliness. This time, she saw a muscle in his jaw twitch. Julian Croft saw none of this directly. He was a phantom in his own home, leaving before dawn and returning long after the day staff had departed. He managed his grief by immersing himself in work, in the cold, hard logic of numbers and contracts. It was a world that made sense, a world he could control, but he was not completely absent. The house was wired with the most sophisticated security system money could buy. From his office downtown, or on his tablet late at night, he could call up a live feed of any room. He rarely looked at Leo's. The sight of his still son was a physical pain, a lance through his heart. But his security chief, Marcus, had been instructed to log any and all anomalies. The first report came a week into Ilara's employment. 1504, housekeeper Vance altered the setting on the environmental control unit. Airflow pattern changed for 90 seconds. 1506, returned to default. Sorry, Julian had dismissed it. The second report came a few days later. 1458, unidentified auditory event, low decibel musical tone, source unknown, duration 30 seconds. This one gave him pause. He pulled up the security footage. He saw Ilara, her back to the camera, cleaning near the window. He couldn't see a music box. He saw her movements, efficient and unobtrusive. He saw his son, motionless. He told himself it was a fluke, feedback in the system. But Ilara was growing bolder, driven by the small responses she was coaxing from the boy. She began to focus on touch. The nurses handled Leo with a brisk clinical efficiency. They turned him on a schedule to prevent bed sores, changed his linens, and checked his monitors. It was maintenance, not connection. Ilara's approach was different. When she straightened his blanket, she let her hand linger on his for a moment longer than necessary. She felt the coolness of his skin, the delicate bones beneath. She started talking to him, her voice a low, soft murmur, just under the threshold of what the room's sensitive microphones might clearly pick up. She told him about the weather, about the fat, clumsy bumblebees she'd seen in the garden, about the color of the sunset over the ocean. She asked for nothing in return. She simply filled the sterile silence with the gentle cadence of her voice. Her biggest discovery came from a photograph. It was the one on his bedside table, of his mother, Aaliyah. In the photo, she was laughing, holding a much younger Leo in her arms. In Leo's chubby hand was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint worn away in patches. Ilara had seen that horse. It was tucked away at the back of a drawer, buried beneath a pile of new, unopened action figures. It felt like a relic from another life. One afternoon, with Nurse Agnes out of the room, Elara retrieved the wooden horse. It was smooth and warm from years of being held. She approached the bed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Look what I found. Do you remember this?" She gently took his limp right hand and curled his fingers around the small toy. His hand was unresponsive, his fingers lax. Disappointment washed over her. She had been so sure. But she left the horse in his hand, resting it on the sheet beside him. She went about her duties, the silence of the room feeling heavier than before. She felt a fool, a housekeeper, playing pretend doctor. As her hour was ending, she went to retrieve the toy. She couldn't leave it there. Nurse Agnes would notice, and there would be questions. She reached for the horse, her fingers brushing against Leo's, and then she felt it. Resistance. It was faint, a barely perceptible tension in his fingers, which were still loosely wrapped around the toy. She pulled again, gently. The resistance grew stronger. His fingers, which had been limp and useless moments before, were now actively, if weakly, gripping the wooden horse. Elara stared, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and vindication. She looked from his hand to his face. His expression was unchanged, his eyes closed. But his hand was telling a different story. It was holding on to the last tangible piece of his mother, a memory he had locked away with the rest of himself. She slowly, carefully let go. His grip remained. He was holding the horse. For the next 5 minutes, until she heard the telltale squeak of Nurse Agnes's orthopedic shoes in the hallway, Leo Croft held that toy. Just before the nurse entered, Elara gently pried the horse from his fingers, the tension fading as she did, and slipped it back into her pocket. The fight was gone, but the message had been sent. He was in there, and he was listening. That night, Julian Croft sat in his cavernous study, a glass of untouched whiskey, sweating on the polished mahogany desk beside him. He was supposed to be reviewing a quarterly report worth 9 figures, but he couldn't focus. Marcus had sent him another alert, this one flagged as urgent. 15:20. Housekeeper Vance in physical contact with the patient for an unapproved duration, 47 seconds. Object of unknown origin placed in patient's hand. Julian's first reaction was a surge of cold fury. This woman, this cleaner, was overstepping her bounds, flagrantly violating the strict protocols he had put in place. He was about to phone Marcus and order her immediate dismissal when he stopped. He pulled up the video feed from Leo's room, time-stamped 15:20. He watched the scene unfold on his tablet, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. He saw Elara place the small object. He recognized it now, the little horse Aaliyah had bought for Leo at a street fair years ago, into his son's hand. He watched her turn away. He watched her return. And then he saw it. He zoomed in, the image pixelating slightly but the action remaining clear. He saw Elara try to take the horse back. He saw his son's fingers, which hadn't moved with purpose in half a year, tighten. He saw the gentle tug of war. It wasn't a spasm. It wasn't a reflex. It was a conscious, deliberate act of possession. Julian felt the air leave his lungs in a ragged gasp. The whiskey glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor, but he didn't even flinch. He just stared at the screen, at the impossible, undeniable truth of it. He rewound the footage, watching it again and again. The specialists with their degrees and their theories had produced nothing. The nurses with their charts and their schedules had maintained a stasis. This woman, with a dust rag and a forgotten toy, had elicited a response. For the first time in 6 agonizing months, Julian Croft felt a sliver of something other than despair. It was a terrifying, fragile thing, so foreign he could barely name it. It was hope. but it was immediately followed by a wave of cold dread. What did this mean, and what in God's name was he going to do about it? The world he had built, with its rules and protocols, had just been shattered by a whisper and a wooden horse. The breakthrough, the undeniable proof, came on a Saturday. Julian had canceled his weekend trip to the Singapore office, an unprecedented move that had sent ripples of confusion through his company. He told his executive assistant it was a personal matter, a statement so vague and uncharacteristic that it only fueled further speculation, but Julian didn't care. He was a man obsessed, spending his hours poring over the security footage from Leo's room, watching Ilara Vance as a hawk watches its prey. He saw the pattern now, the subtle changes, the introduction of new stimuli, and the fleeting, almost invisible reactions from his son. He was caught between a lifetime of trusting experts and the irrefutable evidence on his screen. Ilara knew she was being watched. She could feel it. The way Mrs. Gable's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, the way the security chief, Marcus, now seemed to be stationed near the second-floor stairwell whenever she was on duty. She knew she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one complaint from Nurse Agnes, and she would be gone. The thought of being barred from this house, from Leo, sent a bolt of cold fear through her. She had to be careful, but she also knew that caution was a luxury she couldn't afford. Leo was communicating, and she had to escalate the conversation. She decided to use the strongest tool she had, the one most deeply connected to memory and emotion, her voice. Not just the soft murmurs she had been using, but something more, a song. It was a lullaby her own mother used to sing to her, a simple melody with gentle, soothing lyrics about a silver boat sailing on a sea of stars. It was a song she hadn't sung in years, a song she had locked away with her own grief. That afternoon, during her cleaning hour, she waited for Nurse Agnes to leave for her break. The room was quiet, filled with the sterile hum of the machines. Ilara moved to the far side of the room, near the window overlooking the cliffs, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the audio sensors. She began to hum, the melody soft and tentative at first. She watched Leo. There was the familiar flicker of his eyelids. Encouraged, she began to sing, her voice a low melodic whisper. "Sail away, my little one, sail away to the sun." She poured all the hope, all the pain, all the fierce protective instinct she possessed into that simple tune. She sang of moonlight and dreams, her voice filling the sterile space with a warmth it had never known. She wasn't looking at the monitors. She was looking at the boy. And as she sang the second verse, it happened. A single tear escaped from the corner of Leo's right eye and traced a slow, silent path down his temple, disappearing into his dark hair. Ilara's voice hitched, but she didn't stop singing. Her own eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, her gaze locked on the boy's face. It was the most profound response yet. Not a twitch, not a flicker, but an emotion, a clear sign of a mind capable of sorrow, of memory, of hearing her. He was weeping. When she finished the song, the room fell silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. The sterile bubble had been pierced. Hope was no longer a fragile sliver. It was a living, breathing presence in the room. In his study 2 floors below, Julian watched the scene on his high-definition monitor, his hands gripping the arms of his leather chair. He had the audio feed patched directly into his sound system, and Ilara's voice, clear and hauntingly beautiful, filled his silent room. He saw the tear. He saw it as clearly as if he were standing by the bed himself. The sight broke something open inside him. The carefully constructed dam of control and emotional detachment he had built around his heart for 6 months shattered, and a raw, ragged sob tore from his throat. He buried his face in his hands, the grief and guilt and terror he had suppressed for so long overwhelming him in a tidal wave. He wept for his wife, for the laughter that no longer echoed in these halls. He wept for his son, trapped in a silent prison while the world went on without him. And he wept with a terrifying, gut-wrenching relief, because that single tear was proof. It was proof that his son was still there. For a long time Julian sat there, the sounds of his own grief the only noise in the vast, empty room. When the storm finally passed, he was left with a stark, cold clarity. The experts were wrong. The protocols were wrong. Everything he had been doing was wrong. He wiped his eyes, his movements stiff and deliberate. He stood up, walked over to the intercom system that connected the entire house, and pressed the button for the second-floor staff office. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, "send Elara Vance to my study, immediately." Elara's heart pounded as she walked the long, silent hallway to Julian Croft's study. This was it. She was going to be fired. Mrs. Gable's face had been a mask of grim satisfaction as she relayed the order. Elara smoothed down her simple apron, her hands trembling slightly. She had overstepped. She had been caught. But as she stood before the imposing oak doors, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She had seen that tear. They could fire her. They could throw her out. But they couldn't take that away from her. She had reached him. She knocked softly. "Come in," a deep voice commanded. The study was like the rest of the house, enormous, immaculate, and cold. A wall of glass offered a panoramic view of the churning ocean below. Julian Croft stood behind a massive desk, his back to her, staring out at the waves. He was a tall, imposing figure, even in the dim light. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Elara asked, her voice quiet but steady. He turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face etched with an exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of a soul worn thin. "Close the door," he said. She did as she was told, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound of finality. He gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "Sit." She sat on the edge of the seat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. "For 3 weeks," he began, his voice low and dangerous, "you have been systematically violating every protocol I have set for my son's care. You have altered his environment. You have introduced unauthorized objects. You have engaged in unapproved physical contact. And just now, you were singing to him." He paused, letting the weight of his accusations hang in the air. "Explain yourself." Elara met his gaze. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce conviction. "Your son is not gone, Mr. Croft," she said simply. "He's trapped. The world you've built for him, the constant noise, the lack of stimulation, it's a prison. I was just trying to open a window." "A window," Julian repeated, his voice laced with bitter skepticism. "The best neurologists in the world have seen my son. They have run every test imaginable. They say his brain shows minimal responsive activity. They call it a profound state of withdrawal. And you, a housekeeper, think you've diagnosed him better?" "I'm not a doctor," Elara conceded. "I don't have a diagnosis, but I have eyes. I saw his hand clench when the purifier was unplugged. I saw his eyelids flutter when the sun came out. I saw his breathing change when he heard music, and I saw him cry when I sang to him." She leaned forward slightly, her quiet intensity filling the space between them. "Mr. Croft, your son is listening. He is feeling. He is in there, and he is fighting. But no one has been fighting with him." Julian stared at her, a war raging behind his eyes. Every instinct, every bit of training and experience from his life in the corporate world told him to shut this down. This was insubordination. This was dangerous sentimentality. But then he saw the footage in his mind's eye again, the small hand gripping the wooden horse, the single tear tracing a path through his son's hair. His logical, ordered world was crumbling. He finally collapsed into his chair, the imposing facade of the billionaire falling away to reveal the terrified father beneath. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to help him," Elara said, her voice softening. "Let me keep trying. Don't tell the nurses. Don't change anything officially. Just let me have that hour every day. Let me try to build a bridge to him." It was the biggest risk of Julian's life, bigger than any hostile takeover or market gamble. He was being asked to put his son's fragile state into the hands of a complete stranger, a woman with no credentials, based on nothing more than her intuition and a few seconds of pixelated video. It was insane. It was illogical. It was everything he was not. "If anything goes wrong," he said, his voice regaining a shard of its usual steel, "if his vitals drop, if there is any negative reaction whatsoever, you are gone. And I will personally see to it that you never work in this state again. Do you understand?" Elara nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. "I understand." "What's the horse?" Julian asked abruptly, his gaze sharp. "The wooden one." "It was in a picture of him with his mother," Elara explained. "I found it in his toy drawer." He held on to it. Julian was silent for a long moment. He remembered the day Aaliyah had bought that horse, a silly, cheap souvenir from a day trip that had been filled with laughter. He had forgotten it completely. But Leo hadn't. "All right," Julian said, the word feeling like a monumental concession. "All right, Vance. We do it your way, for now." A new, fragile alliance was forged in the silence of that room, a secret pact between a desperate father and a quiet observer, bound by the hope of reaching a boy lost in the depths of his own mind. The real investigation was about to begin. The alliance between Julian and Elara was a clandestine operation, a conspiracy of two conducted in the hushed corridors of the Croft mansion. To the rest of the staff, nothing had changed. Elara was still just the housekeeper, efficient and invisible. Julian was still the remote grieving tycoon. But behind the scenes, a quiet revolution was underway. Julian disabled the audio alerts from Leo's room that went to his security chief, rerouting them exclusively to his personal devices. He gave Elara a small burner phone, their only method of direct communication. "Text me after every session," he had instructed. "Tell me everything." And so she did. Elara's daily cleaning hour became the focal point of their lives. With Julian's tacit approval, she grew bolder. She brought in a small pot of jasmine, its sweet scent a gentle counterpoint to the room's antiseptic smell. Leo's heart rate would elevate by a few beats whenever she misted its leaves. She read to him not from children's books, but from poetry, Wordsworth and Frost, her voice a steady, rhythmic cadence. She noticed that his breathing would deepen and even out during the readings, as if he were being lulled by the meter of the verse. Her most significant tool remained the wooden horse. It became their communicative artifact. She would place it in his hand at the beginning of each session. At first, his grip was a faint reactive tension, but day by day it grew stronger, more deliberate. One afternoon, as she was telling him about a family of quail she had seen in the garden, she felt him move. His thumb, ever so slowly, stroked the smooth, worn back of the horse. It was a tiny, repetitive motion, a self-soothing gesture. Elara's breath hitched. She immediately texted Julian. "He's petting the horse." Miles away, in the middle of a hostile board meeting, Julian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen under the table. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips, a sight so unusual that his CFO faltered mid-sentence. Julian excused himself from the room, his heart pounding with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. He called up the live feed on his phone, watching the tiny, miraculous movement of his son's thumb. This was better than closing any deal. This was a sign of life. Their secret partnership began to change Julian. He started coming home earlier, foregoing late-night business dinners. He would sit in his study, the live feed from Leo's room playing on a large monitor, watching Elara work. He saw the gentleness in her touch, the patience in her voice. He saw how she transformed that sterile clinical space into a sanctuary, if only for an hour a day. He was witnessing a form of care so profound and intuitive it defied all the medical textbooks and expert opinions he had paid for. He started to feel a deep, burning shame for his own absence, for outsourcing his son's care and his own grief to paid professionals. Driven by this new sense of purpose, Julian turned his formidable resources to the past. If Leo was this responsive, then the initial diagnosis had to be wrong. Something had been missed. He began in his own files, pulling the mountain of medical reports he had amassed over the past 6 months. It was a dense forest of jargon and clinical observations, all painting the same bleak picture. Pervasive refusal syndrome, profound catatonic withdrawal, unresponsive. He also started looking into the period before the accident. Aaliyah, his late wife, had been meticulous. She kept detailed journals. Julian found them locked in her old writing desk, a place he hadn't been able to bring himself to open. Her elegant script filled page after page. He started reading, his heart aching with every word. Most of it was about their life, her love for Leo, her hopes for their future. But then, in a volume from the year before her death, he found something that made him freeze. An entry dated 10 months before the accident. Dr. Finch seems concerned about Leo's allergies again. He wants to put him on a new daily medication, an antihistamine, he says, but stronger than the usual ones. Leo seems so tired lately. Dr. Tosihor. Finch says it's just the allergies wearing him down, but I don't know. He seems muted, less like my bubbly boy. Dr. Alistair Finch. He had been Julian's doctor since childhood and Leo's since birth. A trusted family friend, a pillar of the medical community. The idea that he could be connected to this was unthinkable. Julian kept reading, his sense of dread growing. 2 weeks later, another entry. Leo had another one of his episodes today. He just zoned out at the breakfast table for a full minute. Dr. Finch called it an absent seizure and increased the dosage. He says it's for the best, to prevent a larger one. Julian is so busy with the merger, I don't want to worry him. But this medication, it scares me. It's like it's putting a veil over my son. At the mansion, Elara was making her own discovery. While organizing a closet in one of the guest rooms, a space Mrs. Gable had vaguely referred to as storage for Mrs. Croft's old things, she found a small leather-bound box. Inside, nestled among old photographs and letters, was a small prescription bottle. The label was for Leo Croft. The drug was something she didn't recognize, but the prescribing physician was Dr. Alistair Finch. The date on the bottle was from the week before the accident. Tucked beneath it was a folded piece of paper. It was a printout from a medical website, a list of side effects for the prescribed drug. Aaliyah must have printed it. Elara scanned the long list: drowsiness, confusion, memory loss, dissociation, and then at the bottom under the heading Rare but Severe Adverse Reactions: catatonia, non-reactivity, pseudocoma. Elara felt a chill crawl up her spine. She took a photo of the bottle and the printout with her burner phone and sent it to Julian with a single word: look. The text arrived as Julian was reading his wife's final journal entry about Leo's health. I'm taking Leo off the medication. I don't care what Alistair says. I made an appointment with a specialist at the Children's Hospital for a second opinion. Something is wrong. I want my son back. The date of the entry was the day before she died. The appointment was for the following Monday, an appointment she never got to keep. Julian stared at the photo on his phone, then at his wife's desperate words on the page. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The allergies, the seizures. Interior, the medication that veiled his son, the convenient diagnosis of psychological trauma after the accident, a perfect cover for a condition that had already been developing. It wasn't grief that had silenced his son. It was poison, administered by the man he had trusted most in the world. A cold, murderous rage, unlike anything he had ever felt, settled deep in his bones. Dr. Finch had not been trying to heal his son. He had been systematically sedating him into oblivion. The question was no longer what was wrong with Leo. The question was why. The revelation hit Julian like a physical blow. Dr. Finch, Uncle Alistair, the man who had attended his wedding, who had held Leo as a newborn, had been poisoning his son. The carefully ordered world Julian inhabited, a world built on logic, loyalty, and predictable outcomes, fractured into a million pieces. The rage was a white-hot fire in his chest, but beneath it was a creeping, icy dread. This was not a simple case of malpractice. This was a deliberate, sustained act of malice. The motive was a gaping black hole in the center of the theory, but the evidence was undeniable. Aaliyah had seen it. She had tried to act, and then she was gone. He called Alara on the burner phone. "Don't say a word of this to anyone," he said, his voice tight and strained. "Act as if nothing has changed. Finch is coming for his weekly checkup on Leo tomorrow. I need you in the room." "Yes, what are you going to do?" Alara asked, her own voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to watch a liar work," Julian said darkly, "and then I'm going to take him apart." The next afternoon the mansion felt charged with a tense, theatrical energy. Dr. Finch arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as he always did. He was a distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair, a kind, crinkling smile, and an air of gentle authority. He greeted Julian with a familiar, sympathetic hand on the shoulder. "How are you holding up, my boy?" he asked, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. Julian had to physically restrain himself from recoiling. He forced a grim, tired nod. "The same, Alistair. No change." They walked to Leo's room together. Alara was inside, ostensibly polishing the large bay windows. Nurse Agnes stood by, ready to recite the week's vitals. The scene was perfectly normal, a sterile tableau Julian had witnessed dozens of times. But today he saw it all through new eyes. He saw the way Dr. Finch barely glanced at Leo himself, his attention focused on the monitors and charts. He saw the almost dismissive way he waved off Nurse Agnes's report. His concern was a performance, his sympathy a well-rehearsed lie. Dr. Finch approached the bed and picked up Leo's chart. "Well, the little man is stable, as always. Vitals are strong. We just have to keep him comfortable and give his mind the time it needs to heal from the trauma." He made a note on the chart. "I think we'll continue with the current regimen. The neurostabilizers are essential to prevent any potential seizure activity from the stress on his system." Julian watched him, his jaw tight. Neurostabilizers. The word was a euphemism, a medical shield for the poison. He glanced at Alara. She was frozen by the window, her knuckles white where she gripped her cleaning cloth. "Doctor," Julian said, his voice dangerously calm, "I was reading some of Aaliyah's old journals last night." Dr. Finch didn't look up from the chart. "Ah, yes, cathartic, I imagine. Good for the grieving process." "She mentioned you were treating Leo for allergies and then for absent seizures before the accident," Julian continued, taking a step closer. "She was concerned about the medication you prescribed. She said it made him muted." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through Dr. Finch's calm facade. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Julian's. "Grief can make a parent overthink things, Julian. Aaliyah was a wonderful mother, but she was prone to anxiety. The medication was a low-dose precautionary measure. Entirely standard procedure." "Standard procedure," Julian repeated, the words tasting like ash. "She had an appointment with a specialist at the Children's Hospital for a second opinion. Did you know that?" The doctor's professional smile tightened. "She may have mentioned it. As I said, she was anxious. It's a shame she never got the chance to have her fears assuaged." The specialist would have told her the exact same thing I did. He was so smooth, so plausible. Julian could feel the truth slipping away, buried under layers of medical authority and feigned sympathy. He needed more. He needed to provoke him. He glanced at Alara, a silent command passing between them. She understood. Slowly, Alara moved from the window to Leo's bedside. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse. Nurse Agnes gasped, "Ma'am, you are not to touch the patient." But Alara ignored her, her focus entirely on Leo. "Leo," she whispered just as she did every day, "it's time to wake up." She gently placed the horse into his right hand. Finch watched, an expression of mild annoyance on his face. "Really, Julian, you must control your staff. This is highly unprofessional. A toy isn't going to—" He stopped mid-sentence, because Leo's fingers, which had been lying limp and open, slowly, deliberately, curled around the wooden horse. His grip was firm, possessive. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't a reflex. It was a conscious act. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. "What is this?" Dr. Finch demanded, his voice losing its smooth edge. "That," Julian said, his voice ringing with cold triumph, "is my son." But Alara wasn't finished. Keeping her eyes on Leo, she began to hum the lullaby, the soft, clear melody filling the room. And then the second miracle happened. Leo's head, which had been facing the ceiling, turned. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a fraction of an inch at a time, until his head was turned on the pillow, facing the source of the sound, facing Alara. And as she continued to hum, his eyelids, which had been sealed for 6 months, fluttered open. His eyes were cloudy, unfocused, but they were open. He was looking. Nurse Agnes let out a choked cry. Julian felt his knees go weak. He stumbled forward, grabbing the bed rail for support, his eyes locked on his son's. Dr. Finch stared, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into something else. Fear. Pure, naked fear. He saw his entire monstrous deception crumbling before his eyes. "It's an involuntary reflex," he stammered, his authority evaporating. "A neurological anomaly. It means nothing." "It means everything," Julian snarled. "It means you're a liar." The spell was broken. Leo's eyes slid shut again, the effort too much for him. But the message had been delivered. The truth was out, exposed in the sterile light of that room. Dr. Finch knew he was caught. He took a step back, his composure shattering completely. "This woman has done something," he accused, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "She has interfered with his treatment. She could have killed him." The core truth was finally revealed, not through a document or a confession, but through a boy's simple, profound response to a lullaby and a wooden horse. The monster was unmasked. And in that moment, Julian Croft knew that this was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about protecting his son and the woman who had saved him from the wrath that was sure to come. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and brutal. Dr. Finch, cornered and exposed, did not crumble. He attacked. Realizing that Julian now saw him as an enemy, he used his decades of accumulated trust and credibility as a weapon. He moved with the speed and precision of a venomous snake. The very next morning, 2 stern-faced individuals from Child Protective Services arrived at the mansion, accompanied by a police officer. They presented Julian with an emergency court order. It alleged child endangerment, citing an unstable home environment, and interference with prescribed medical care by an unqualified domestic employee. The petition, filed by Dr. Alistair Finch, painted a damning picture. A grieving, erratic father, manipulated by a new housekeeper, was denying his fragile son the essential care that was keeping him alive. The order had 2 immediate devastating effects. Alara Vance was to be removed from the premises immediately, barred from all contact with Leo Croft. And Leo was to be transferred to a long-term care facility under the direct supervision of Dr. Finch, pending a full custody hearing. It was a masterful, vicious counterattack. Julian was blindsided. He stood in his marble foyer, the legal papers trembling in his hand, as he watched them escort a pale, shaken Ilara out of his home. She looked back at him, her eyes filled with fear, not for herself, but for Leo. "Don't let him take him," she mouthed, before the heavy doors closed behind her. Julian's lawyers descended on the mansion, their faces grim. They confirmed the gravity of the situation. Dr. Finch was a highly respected physician with deep connections. He had presented sworn affidavits from Nurse Agnes and 2 other specialists, all attesting to Julian's erratic behavior and Ilara's bizarre quasi-medical rituals. He had framed her gentle methods as dangerous folk medicine, and Julian's support of her as proof of his unfitness as a guardian. The legal battle would be an uphill one. The worst part was Leo. As the medical transport team prepared to move him, Julian stood by his son's bed, a feeling of profound helplessness washing over him. The boy seemed to sense the change. His resting heart rate was elevated, and the nurses noted a new persistent tension in his limbs. He was still, but it was the stillness of fear, not of peace. The wooden horse, which Julian had tried to place in his hand, now lay untouched on the sheets beside him. Without Ilara's presence, without her voice, her touch, the bridge to his consciousness had collapsed. He was retreating, pulling back into the silent darkness. The small gains they had made were being erased before Julian's eyes. Watching them wheel his son out of the room he had occupied for 6 months was the most painful moment of Julian's life. He felt as if his heart was being physically carved from his chest. He had failed him. He had failed Aaliyah. He had let the monster not only into his house, but into his son's veins, and now that monster was taking his child away. The first 48 hours after Leo was taken were a blur of rage and despair for Julian. The house was silent again, but it was a dead, suffocating silence now, devoid of the fragile hope Ilara had cultivated. He found himself wandering into Leo's empty room, the faint scent of jasmine still hanging in the air. He saw the book of poetry she had left on the bedside table. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the worn cover. This was his fault. His blindness, his trust in the wrong person, had led to this. But Julian Croft had not built a global empire by succumbing to despair. On the 3rd day, the grief solidified into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Finch had started a war, and Julian intended to finish it. He assembled his team in the mansion's vast dining room, his lead counsel, a sharp, relentless woman named Lena Petrova, a grizzled, cynical private investigator named Frank Miller, who specialized in digging up the dirt on the powerful, and the head of his corporate security, Marcus, whose loyalty was absolute. "I don't want to win a custody battle," Julian told them, his voice low and intense. "I want to destroy him. I want to uncover why he did this, and I want him to pay for it. For everything." The investigation began on 2 fronts. Lena and her team focused on the legal angle, preparing for the upcoming hearing. They filed motions, deposed nurses, and began looking for cracks in Finch's professional history. Frank Miller, meanwhile, was tasked with a much dirtier job, digging into every aspect of Alistair Finch's life, his finances, his relationships, his past. "Everyone has a secret, Mr. Croft," Frank had said, a grim smile on his face. "You just have to be willing to pay to find it." Julian also had a crucial secret asset, Ilara. Though barred from the property, she was not out of the fight. Julian set her up in a secure hotel suite, a phone line routed directly to him. She was their expert witness, the only one who truly understood Leo's responses. She recounted every detail of her time with Leo, every subtle reaction, every small breakthrough. She described the lullaby, the scent of the flowers, the texture of the wooden horse. Lena's legal team recorded it all, building a case based on a narrative of intuitive care that would stand in stark contrast to Finch's cold, clinical approach. The crisis peaked a week before the hearing. Julian received a call from the care facility. Leo had developed a fever. His condition was deteriorating. Dr. Finch had informed the court that the boy's system was in shock, likely due to the abrupt cessation of the unauthorized and harmful stimuli he had been subjected to. He was using Leo's regression, the very regression he had caused by separating him from Alara, as proof of his own claims. It was a cruel, brilliant move. Julian felt the trap closing around him. He was losing. Time was running out, the child was regressing, and the antagonist's narrative was winning. The pressure was immense. Julian Croft channeled his fear and rage into a relentless, methodical assault. He was fighting a war on two fronts, the pristine, rule-bound battlefield of the courtroom and the shadowy, grimy alleys of his enemy's past. He put the full weight of his fortune and influence into the fight, transforming from a passive, grieving father into a warrior king defending his heir. Lena Petrova and her legal team worked around the clock. They subpoenaed 2 decades of Dr. Finch's professional records. They found a pattern: wealthy, elderly patients with no close relatives whose health would mysteriously decline under his exclusive care, and who would, coincidentally, leave generous donations to a research foundation that Finch controlled. It was damning but circumstantial. It didn't directly prove what he had done to Leo. The real breakthrough came from Frank Miller, the private investigator. He had been digging into Finch's finances, a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations. "He's not just a doctor, Mr. Croft," Frank reported, sliding a thick file across Julian's desk. "He's a gambler, a bad one, owes millions to some very unpleasant people. But even that wasn't the core motive. The gambling debts explained a need for money, but not the specific, cruel targeting of his son. The why was still missing. The key came from an unexpected source. Alara? Confined to her hotel room, she spent her days going over the notes she had made, replaying every moment in Leo's room in her mind. She kept coming back to one detail: the medication. It wasn't just one drug, she told Julian over the secure line. The nurses switched the IV bags. But there was one prescription bottle he always checked himself. It was different from the others. He kept it in his personal bag. She described the bottle, a small amber vial with a custom label from a private compounding pharmacy. That was the thread Frank needed. He focused his investigation on the pharmacy. It took a hefty bribe and a veiled threat, but he finally got what he was looking for: the pharmacy's records, and there it was. A custom-ordered drug, a potent experimental sedative prescribed by Dr. Finch not just for Leo Croft, but for another patient 10 years prior, Julian's own father, Thomas Croft. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. Thomas Croft had died of what was ruled a sudden aggressive dementia. In his final months, he had been nonverbal and unresponsive, cared for exclusively by Dr. Finch, and in his will, he had bypassed Julian, his only son, with whom he'd had a difficult, strained relationship, and left a controlling interest in the original family holding company, not to him, but in a trust for his firstborn grandson. The trust was to be managed by a single executor until the grandson turned 25. The executor was Dr. Alistair Finch. It was a breathtakingly evil, long con. Finch had likely hastened Thomas Croft's death, securing his position as trustee. He had then systematically sedated Leo, intending to keep him in a non-responsive state for the next 17 years, giving him complete control over a fortune that rivaled Julian's own. Alia must have stumbled onto a piece of it, her suspicions about the medication threatening to unravel his entire scheme. Her accidental death was a fortuitous coincidence that allowed him to cement his control under the guise of caring for a traumatized child. He wasn't just trying to control Leo's trust, Julian said, the words cold as ice. He was trying to steal my father's legacy. He was trying to steal my son's entire life. Now they had it all, the means, the method, and the motive. They had financial records, pharmaceutical evidence, and a clear timeline of malice. Lena Petrova's eyes gleamed. "This is no longer a custody hearing," she said. "This is a criminal case." The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was a sterile wood-paneled chamber. Dr. Finch sat at the opposing table, looking calm and authoritative, the picture of a concerned physician. He had his specialists lined up, ready to testify to Leo's fragile state and Julian's instability. He thought he was in control. Julian's team moved first. Lena Petrova stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we are filing a motion to dismiss this custody case and to introduce new evidence pertaining to criminal conduct on the part of the petitioner, Dr. Alistair Finch." A wave of murmurs went through the courtroom. Finch's lawyer leaped to his feet, objecting furiously. But the judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, was intrigued. "On what grounds, Ms. Petrova?" "On the grounds of attempted murder, financial fraud, and a pattern of criminal negligence," Lena said, her voice ringing through the silent room. One by one, she laid out the evidence, the offshore accounts, the gambling debts, the records from the compounding pharmacy, the uncanny parallels between Leo's condition and that of Julian's late father, the trust. With each new piece of information, the color drained from Dr. Finch's face. His mask of calm dignity began to crack. The final devastating blow was not a document, but a person. Lena called a surprise witness. The defense calls Nurse Ramirez to the stand. A nervous-looking woman in her 50s walked to the witness box. She had been one of Thomas Croft's private nurses. Frank Miller had found her living in quiet retirement in Arizona. In a quiet, trembling voice, Nurse Ramirez testified that she had long held suspicions about Dr. Finch's treatment of Julian's father. She spoke of the same secretive personal medication, the rapid decline that defied all medical explanation. She had been fired after voicing her concerns to the doctor. "He told me I was imagining things," she said, tears in her eyes. "He said Mr. Croft was an old man and his mind was simply going. But it wasn't. It felt like he was being erased." Dr. Finch finally broke. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of rage and panic. "Lies, all of it, lies. This is a fabrication by a desperate man," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. His frantic outburst, his complete loss of composure in the face of the evidence, sealed his fate more effectively than any testimony. The judge slammed her gavel, her face a mask of thunder. The confrontation was over. The victory was absolute. Police officers entered the courtroom. They handcuffed a sputtering, defeated Alistair Finch and led him away. The custody case was dismissed on the spot. The judge issued an immediate order transferring full medical authority for Leo Croft back to his father. Julian felt a wave of relief so profound it left him breathless. He had won. He had cleared his name, honored Aaliyah's memory, and saved his son. He left the courthouse and went straight to the care facility, the court order in his hand. He walked into Leo's room. It was cold and impersonal. Leo was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead from the fever. Julian sat by the bed and took his son's limp hand. "It's over, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. We're going home." He had one more thing to do. He took out his phone and called Alara. "We got him," Julian said, his voice breaking. "It's over. Come to the house. Leo needs you." He could hear her weeping with relief on the other end of the line. The battle was won. Now the long, slow work of healing could finally begin. The vindication in the courtroom was a public victory, but the true triumph was quiet and private. It happened that evening, back in the familiar sanctuary of Leo's bedroom at the mansion. The medical equipment, the sterile charts, the presence of clinical strangers, all of it was gone. Julian had dismissed the entire nursing staff, save for one he had personally vetted to help with the transition. The room was warm and softly lit. Ilara arrived just as dusk was settling over the ocean, painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. When Julian opened the front door to her, they stood for a moment in silence, the unspoken ordeal they had shared hanging between them. He had never noticed before how the soft light of the foyer caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Thank you," he said, the two words carrying the weight of 1,000 others, "for everything." "How is he?" she asked, her voice filled with anxious hope. "He's home," Julian replied, leading her up the grand staircase. "He's been waiting for you." When Ilara walked into Leo's room, it was as if the sun had finally broken through the clouds. She went straight to his bed, her movements filled with a familiar, gentle grace. Leo was restless, his brow furrowed in a feverish sleep. His small hand lay on the sheets, his fingers twitching. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed and simply took his hand in hers. "I'm here, Leo," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." At the sound of her voice, a visible change came over the boy. The tension seemed to melt from his small frame. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened and slowed. It was as if her presence was an anchor, steadying him in the turbulent sea of his sedated consciousness. Julian watched from the doorway, his heart aching with a profound sense of wonder and gratitude. Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse. She placed it into Leo's palm, curling his fingers around it. "Look who's back," she murmured. Then she began to hum. It was the lullaby. The simple, beautiful melody filled the quiet room. And then the climax of their long journey arrived, not in a dramatic shout, but in a near-silent whisper. As Ilara hummed, Leo's eyes, which had been closed since his traumatic removal from the house, fluttered open. This time, they weren't cloudy or unfocused. They were clear, and they were looking directly at Ilara. His lips parted. A small raspy sound emerged, a voice unused for half a year. La, ra. The single word, broken and faint, struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled into the room, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a sob. Ilara gasped, tears streaming down her face as she squeezed Leo's hand. The boy's gaze shifted, moving from Ilara to the towering figure of his father standing by the bed. His eyes, so like his mother's, held a flicker of recognition. A second, even quieter word escaped his lips. "Dad." That was the word that broke Julian completely. He sank to his knees by the bedside, burying his face in the blankets, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. It was a release of all the pain, the fear, the guilt of the past 6 months. Leo, his Leo, had called him Dad. He was there. He was back. Ilara placed a gentle hand on Julian's shoulder, and the three of them stayed like that for a long time, a broken family starting to piece itself back together in the quiet twilight, their shared tears baptizing a new beginning. Dr. Finch's defeat was total. Faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud and the testimony of Nurse Ramirez, his professional and personal life imploded. The story became a media sensation. The brilliant, heroic doctor revealed as a monster, preying on the families who trusted him most. He was arrested, his assets were frozen, and he faced a barrage of charges that would ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The foundation he had used to launder money was dissolved, its funds redirected by court order to a new charity for victims of medical abuse established in Aaliyah Croft's name. With the architect of their suffering gone, the real work of healing began for the new family unit in the house on the cliff. Leo's recovery was a slow, delicate process. Weaning him off the powerful sedatives Finch had prescribed was the first hurdle. There were difficult days, days of withdrawal, confusion, and night terrors, but through it all Ilara was his constant. She rarely left his side, sleeping in a chair by his bed, her presence a steady, reassuring anchor. She filled his world not with a flood of stimulation, but with a gentle, curated stream of sensations. The smell of baking bread from the kitchen, the feeling of soft grass on his bare feet as they carried him into the garden, the sound of her reading stories in a calm, even voice. Julian, for his part, underwent his own profound transformation. He delegated the vast majority of his corporate responsibilities, a move that shocked the financial world. His life no longer revolved around boardrooms and stock prices. It revolved around his son. He learned, with Ilara's patient guidance, how to simply be with Leo. He learned to sit in silence, to read a book aloud without needing a response, to celebrate the smallest of victories, a day without a fever, a flicker of a smile, a new word. He shed the armor of the cold, controlling billionaire and rediscovered the father he had been before grief had walled him off. The mansion itself began to change. The sterile museum-like atmosphere was replaced by the clutter of a real home. Leo's drawings, at first just abstract scribbles but slowly evolving into recognizable shapes, were taped to the billion-dollar refrigerator. The echoes were replaced with the sound of quiet laughter. The wooden horse remained Leo's totem, a constant companion. But as the months passed, he began to reach for other things: Ilara's hand, his father's arm. His trust, once locked away inside him, was slowly extending to encompass his new, safe world. The sanctuary space Ilara had created in his room expanded to include the entire house, most notably the neglected greenhouse on the property. Together, the three of them brought it back to life, planting herbs and flowers, their hands in the soil. It became a place of quiet connection, a symbol of their own regrowth. 1 year after the day of the hearing, the house on the cliff was unrecognizable. It was filled with light, with warmth, with life. On a bright, sunny afternoon, Julian and Ilara stood on the great lawn, watching Leo. He was no longer a silent, still figure in a bed. He was a 9-year-old boy, dressed in a small tuxedo, chasing a soccer ball across the grass. He was still quiet, still healing from the neurological and psychological trauma, but he was running, he was laughing. They were hosting the inaugural fundraising gala for the Aaliyah Croft Foundation. Hundreds of guests were mingling inside, but the three of them had stolen a moment for themselves. Leo, tripping over the ball, looked up at them and grinned, his smile bright and genuine. "I got it," he shouted, his voice clear and strong. Julian wrapped an arm around Ilara's waist, pulling her close. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her journey from quiet housekeeper to the heart of this new family complete. They were no longer an employer and his employee, or even just allies. They were partners, building a future on a foundation of shared trauma and profound love. He looked down at her, his heart full. "She would have loved you," he said softly. Ilara smiled, her eyes on the boy. "She would have loved this," she corrected gently. "Seeing him happy, seeing you happy." The final resolution was not a dramatic event, but this quiet, perfect moment of peace. The antagonist was defeated, the child was thriving, and the found family was whole, solidified not by blood, but by a bond forged in the fires of crisis and healing. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the scene, it was clear that true wealth was not measured in stock portfolios or sprawling mansions. It was measured in the quiet trust between a father and a son, and in the profound, intuitive wisdom that could see a flicker of hope in the deepest darkness and have the courage to fan it into a flame. Before we say goodbye, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that.